Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. This is where we take time each week for a deeper look into the previous Sunday's sermon. My name is Matt. I'm the executive and discipleship pastor here at Ridgecrest, and join with me is our senior pastor, Mike Lestis.
Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Did you have an exciting weekend?
We did. It was actually pretty low key, though. I mean, it was exciting in the sense that we didn't have as much to do as normal, which is kind of nice. And I got to enjoy baseball as always. It's kind of a family thing that we do on a regular basis. But yeah, it was a good weekend overall. How about y'all?
Yeah, it was good. You know, we had a busy weekend. Doing some stuff around the house and that sort of thing. So it's full weekend, but it was
got a haircut.
I did, yeah, and I got my kind of summer cut. So
Steven did too.
That's right.
You can't see him, but his hair looks way different. If you have seen him, you know this.
And so it's it's one of those things where you get in this heat and humidity, and that thick luscious hair that I had before can hold some sweat.
I'm sure it can. Man, I told Lorelai the other day when we walked outside, it was like walking into a bathtub.
Oh,
I mean, it's just it was so humid, so hot. It's terrible.
Yeah. So
I love Mississippi. I love the summer for the most part, but like there are some weeks where you're just like, this is miserable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Last week was one of those.
It was. So, but yeah. So now I'm good for the rest of the year, and who knows? It probably just grow back out to what it was before, and then this time next year.
You keep hoping it does, right?
That's right.
You don't want it to stop.
I know. That's right. That's always if you see me like growing my hair out, that's why. It's because it's like I don't know how much longer I'll be able to do this, and so like I want to enjoy it while I can, and then because one day it will not grow back quite as well. So this was a first test because this is the first time I'd let it get that long in a few years, and so it was my first test to see if I could still do it. I still got it.
Oh yeah.
So on that, let's transition to Philemon.
Because there's obvious transitions
Obviously.
from the lusciousness of Matt's hair to Philemon.
Absolutely. So this is the last week of the series, and so I guess this has been 5 weeks?
5 weeks.
5 weeks.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's a very short letter, but it's filled with stuff. Filled with specifically what we looked at is this kind of idea of reconciliation and relationships, and you see a very clear example, and you see Paul, teaching that, and then in this week's sermon, you kind of talk through, showing some examples of how Paul practiced that, which we'll get into a little bit.
Yeah.
But your first point was this idea of not, essentially not settling for what's required, but doing more than that, and kind of risking to do more than that. And because that's kind of what Paul said there in verse 21. He suggests that he knows Philemon will do more than what is asked. And so the question is doing more than required something that is taught, or is it maybe something that's just developed over time and during that kind of spiritual growth process?
I would make the argument that it is both.
Okay.
Here's why I say that, because if you go to a place like Matthew 5-7, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking to the crowd there, and one of the things that is interesting to me about that entire time that he's speaking is he kind of raises the bar on everything. So like he's like, you've heard it said you shouldn't murder. Well, yeah, but you also need to understand that when you're angry in your heart and you speak in anger against a neighbor or against somebody who's near you, you're committing murder in your heart. And so like you have to understand these are issues that are deeper than just the actions themselves. That there's a step beyond the action that you need to investigate in yourself. What do your motivations look like? What do your desires look like? And what do they say about who you are and what's actually going on inside of you? He does the same thing with adultery and lust. He's like, listen, if you look at a woman lustfully, you are committing adultery in your heart. If you're coveting her and wanting to take her as your own, that's adultery. And so like he just keeps raising the bar in these different places, and I think ultimately he does that is because at their heart the commandments themselves are commandments that should be undergirded with love.
Yeah.
So if I love my neighbor, I'm not going to speak in anger toward my neighbor. I'm not going to want to murder them. I'm not going to attempt to murder them. Like I love my neighbor. I don't want that to happen to them. I don't want to take their things from them. Yeah. And so that's an act of love. I could easily do all those things without love in my
Yeah.
heart. Like I could, not easily, but like I could easily avoid stealing from my neighbor, without loving my neighbor, without any kind of motivation in my heart of I'm choosing to love my neighbor and not take their things. And so I think all throughout the standard's always been there.
Yeah.
It's just that we need to be reminded of that. Now, I do think that it's a part of the process of sanctification, because as we begin to experience what it is to obey and to do what it is that God requires us or desires for us to do, we all of a sudden realize like this is what a life of flourishing looks like. I want
Yeah.
to experience this more deeply. And as we flourish and experience that flourishing more deeply, we kind of want to take it that extra step. Okay, this is what this looks like. What would it look like if I went one step further?
Yeah.
And so, I think it's a process of, yes, this has always kind of been taught, even though, and the Pharisees, I was reading Matthew again this morning, and the Pharisees are really clear about, like, they created these lines where it was like, as long as I do this, I'm good.
Yeah.
And Jesus is always challenging that. He's like, but really, why are you doing this?
Right.
And I think we should ask ourselves that question on a regular basis. Am I obeying because I love God and I love people, or am I obeying just because this is what God has said and I want to make sure I can check that box at the end of the day? And there can be overlap between those two things, but one can easily exist without the other. I can easily check the box without love in my heart.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of what Paul's after when he's encouraging Philemon. He says, "Listen, I'm confident that you're going to do what I've asked you to do, but I also think that you can do more.
Yeah.
And I'm not afraid to tell you to, like, don't be afraid to take that extra step."
Yeah. I don't think, in that kind of sanctification process, you mentioned, that term in the Sermon Sunday, I believe there's kind of three active participants. You've got, speaking from my perspective, I've got my role in that process where I'm pursuing God, pursuing His Word, spending time with Him, doing these things to pursue and kind of desire and chase after God and grow spiritually. And then you've got, God's part where He is now softening my heart to these things. He's using the Spirit to lead me in these different directions, and making me more open and receptive to kind of go beyond that minimum expectation because my heart has been changed. But then you have that third person, and that's the person who's teaching me, and kind of like you said, it's a both and I think you see that here with Paul and Philemon. It's clear that they had this relationship, as we talked about a few weeks ago. And so I guess to kind of hone in even a little bit more on that is how does that person, maybe I'm in a position of Paul, or maybe someone who's listening is kind of in this position of Paul, and they have someone that they're in this discipling relationship. Is there anything specific that you would kind of say, hey, here's some specific ways to kind of teach this and trust that God's going to do His part to kind of soften their heart so they develop this attitude of, going beyond minimum expectation? But how can I maybe teach that?
I think that's a good question. I was thinking about another place where we kind of see this in Paul is he's talking in 1 Corinthians 10 about making decisions about, like, the things that we do that maybe aren't, like, clearly outlined in Scripture, the things that we should and shouldn't do. So, for example, the thing that he's kind of talking through is eating meat sacrificed to idols and all this stuff, and he's kind of talking the Corinthians through this, and he says in verse 23, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. And so, like, there's this kind of underlying, like, listen, there's a lot that you can do in grace. Yeah. Like, you can experience a lot of different things, and the freedom that comes with that. But the thing that ultimately is going to be best for you and for those around you is that you use that freedom to love others, to build others up, to strengthen the body. And that means sometimes that you choose things that are not, like, maybe most beneficial to you, or maybe most satisfying to you, but instead you pick things that are going to be for the benefit of another. And so just because something's lawful for you, again, this goes back to that idea of, hey, I'm allowed to do this, I'm going to come up to that line and be satisfied with that, doesn't mean that I should automatically say that, yeah, I should do that. And so there's always this underlying consideration of what will this do to my neighbor? And I don't know that there's an easy way to teach that to somebody else other than I think it has to go back to the mindset of Christ is always the benefit of the other. And we have to do everything in our power to cultivate that in ourselves. And I just don't think that we can look at that and say, well, you're going to experience the immediate benefits of peace and joy. And I mean, you may experience those things. You may be frustrated by that at first. But ultimately, I think in the end, we'll get to the end and be like, I haven't wasted my life sacrificing my life for other people. It's been worth it, and I've been glad I did it. And it's just not something that there's like this immediate reward at the end of that. I don't think there may be some, but like for the most part, I don't want to encourage people to obey just because all of a sudden they'll receive a benefit from something that they've done for somebody else. I think sometimes there's going to be this desire in us to see the good of another. And that's just a process of continually. I think the key word, the fruit of the Spirit that I think you would want to look at most for this is the fruit of self-control.
Yeah.
A willingness to say no to myself, yes to somebody else, that sort of thing. That is it's a hugely important part of this. I'm going to take a step beyond obedience here and do more than is required.
Yeah. I think, that kind of comes back to this idea of constantly looking at how I can sacrifice myself for someone else, but also knowing that I'm part of a family, a body of believers. So I know that even though I'm exerting myself and sacrificing for so-and-so, I don't have to worry about it because I've got a brother or sister in Christ who's going to be sacrificing themselves for me. And it's constant, group, idea. And spoiler alert, there might be a sermon going that direction here soon. So, but I think
I'll be sitting in that chair next week.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right.
I'll be asking Matt the questions next week because he's going to be the one that's preaching the sermon. Well, maybe not next week. I guess Logan will do next week, and then
okay.
Well, I'll be in that chair eventually.
That's right. So, I guess it would be the next one, maybe.
Yeah.
So, So, I think it all comes back to this crucial idea of us being a community of believers where, I'm okay sacrificing everything I've got for the body of Christ because, in this family, because I recognize that, they're going to do the same for me and we're going to be there for each other kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. So, Philemon essentially has been this really story of reconciliation, relational reconciliation. And so you used, a couple of examples that, probably talk about here as well as maybe a little bit later. This idea of like Paul, he comes from a place of having dealt with some, reconciliation that had to take place. And there's evidence in this letter of that. Where Paul had this disagreement with Mark, and now you see this disagreement between, Philemon and Onesimus. And so the question I have is, when you're looking at these disagreements, the situation between Philemon and Onesimus is a little bit different, but when you look at the relationship between Mark and Paul and that conflict that you referenced in the sermon, they had this disagreement and this kind of stark disagreement in which it really causes this fractured relationship. I guess the question I have is how can we maybe practice gracious disagreement with one another without it getting to this point to where it kind of fractures a relationship?
I think the key word there is the word humility. So we look at, I think, a good example of kind of how to practice this, and you're going to be like, Michael, this is so unfair. The relationship between Jesus and Peter. So we have Peter deny Christ 3 times, and then we get to the end of John, and Jesus restores him. Here's the thing. Jesus doesn't do this in a posture of pride. Like, he's not like, you offended me, you have to beg me for forgiveness. I was right, you were wrong. It's more like, I'm going to gently restore you to relationship with me. Peter knew he was wrong. Yeah. Peter was embarrassed by the way he behaved. We know this because as soon as he betrays Jesus the 3rd time, he goes out and he weeps bitterly, it says. And so he knew that he had been wrong, and Peter graciously undergoes the process of being restored. And so there is humility on the part of Jesus, not to hold that against Peter, not to be prideful, and not to. I mean, I wouldn't expect Jesus to be prideful because he obviously is the epitome of humility. But we also have Peter, on the other hand, receiving that restoration in a posture of humility. I think that's probably the way for disagreement within the church, any kind of disagreement, interpersonally, that sort of thing, is we always need to take on an air of humility, understanding that we're sinners, that we're flawed, that we may have a flawed perspective on things, that we may not know the entire story of somebody's life.
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful not to make overarching universal judgments about people, assuming that they're wrong and we're right. I think that's the other thing is when you think about humility and kind of how it goes with disagreement, the thing that we're maybe arguing over, the thing that we're disagreeing about, it doesn't need to be a matter of who's going to win this contest. That's where we get into the trouble of pride a lot of times.
Yeah.
It's not a contest to see who's going to win the argument. It's ultimately, let's come to a place of truth and see if we can get there, not compromising.
Yeah.
I want to be careful to say that. Like, it's not like we're picking up the word and then saying, well, I'm going to compromise the word and say, well, just because I want to preserve this friendship, I'm just going to compromise on this. I mean, we think about the disagreement that Paul and Barnabas have. It's not over biblical issues.
Right.
It's over the way ministry happened.
Right.
And so I don't know that Paul was in the right in saying, listen, I don't want Mark to go with us. And
Right.
I don't know that Barnabas was in the right in saying, Mark has to go with us.
Yeah.
I think it was a matter of there wasn't a clear path, and they just fought about it. There was the sharp disagreement. This is the way Acts is translated in the ESV. And they separated. Yeah. And I think there probably was a little bit of pride and a little bit of frustration on their part that leaked through, and ultimately, but they eventually heal that. But I think for us, when it comes to things that aren't clearly lined out in Scripture, we should approach all those things with humility, understanding that we're not infallible, that we are not in any way, shape, or form perfect. And so we need to be willing to say, I might be wrong about this. And I want to approach you with grace and humility. We may eventually end up having to disagree about this, but I don't think that needs to mean that we're no longer going to be able to work together, to be together, to be in relationship with one another.
Yeah, that's good. And so kind of along those same lines, whenever you're looking at, when you do have this disagreement in ministry, and again, what we're talking about disagreements here, as we see kind of between Paul, Barnabas, and Mark's situation, is it's not theological issues. It's just it's a strategical issue, I guess. Looking at, I think we should do this when this person thinks we should do this, and we have these kind of disagreements. And so the question is like maybe you get to this point and you're dealing with something where it's caused this fractured relationship because you didn't go about it in a gracious way with humility, like we just talked about. And so, I think we should do ministry this way. This person thinks that we should do ministry this way. We fought about it, and now we have this big disagreement, and we're apart, on things.
Yes.
How does discipleship kind of continue if a fractured relationship happens, in ministry? I guess first and foremost, you have to have reconciliation. Yeah,
at some point,
because that's what we've been talking about all throughout Philemon. But beyond that, how do you kind of continue discipleship? Or I guess, can it even happen before the reconciliation takes place, or how does it happen after? Like, what does that kind of continuing discipling relationship look like in that context?
Okay, so if we just take Acts 15 as an example, and again, this is prescriptive, not descriptive,
right?
Which means basically, did I say it's prescriptive, not descriptive? I meant to say this is descriptive, not prescriptive.
Right.
I'm glad I heard myself again. Descriptive means that we're just looking at something that happened, and it's not telling us this is the right or the wrong way to do it. Prescriptive means that it's telling us how to do something. Yeah. So in this case, we're just getting a description of something that happened in the ministry of Paul and Barnabas. So what we see there, though, is that Paul didn't say, Mark's no longer a believer. Mark can't be a part of our fellowship. Mark's not a part of the family of God. What he said is, I don't want him to go on mission with us.
Yeah.
And And so what he does effectively to continue discipleship in Mark's life and the lives of, the discipling relationships kind of reciprocating, he just hands him off to Barnabas. And he's like, I'm gonna go with Silas, and Barnabas, you and Mark can go together, and we're gonna separate. And, I'm going to trust that the Lord's going to use that. Maybe we don't have those words from Paul, but my assumption is God. He understands God's sovereignty and providence and life, and so my guess is Paul, thinking in terms of God's providence, it's like, all right, this is the way this is going to be now. And so I think that there are times where if we have discipling relationships that ultimately lead to a point of we get to a point of separation because of this strategery. You used strategical.
Yeah.
I just thought of George W. Bush's strategery.
Yeah.
Because I love it. But so when you have that disagreement over that kind of thing,
Yeah.
It's okay to hand off a believer to somebody else that you trust and is a mature believer to continue that discipling process.
Yeah.
Again, these are all relationship built things though.
Right.
Like, so Paul knew Barnabas. Paul had experienced ministry with Barnabas. Paul had been discipled by Barnabas and had discipled Barnabas, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And so like there is this ongoing relationship that now Mark's going to be in Barnabas' hands, and Silas is going to go with Paul, and we're going to figure it out from there. So I think that there's got to be a willingness at some points. Like, God is sovereign over these things. God is providential, and He's working actively in our lives. And so, like, there may come circumstances where it's better for somebody to continue a discipling relationship in somebody else's hands, and that's okay.
Yeah.
The way Paul puts it is one waters, one plants, one waters, and the other reaps. I mean, like, there are going to be times where we're going to be the one planting, sometimes we're going to be the ones watering, and sometimes we're going to be the ones reaping. We don't make those decisions. We are just faithful in what God puts in front of you. That's really all you're all called to do.
Yeah. And so kind of to build on that, unfortunately, we live in a sinful world. We're all sinners. Those of us who, are followers of Christ, we're essentially saints who sin now. We're no longer identified as sinners, but we still sin. And so unfortunately, you're going to have fractured relationships. Yeah. We see this here with Paul and Barnabas. You referenced 2 Timothy, and kind of looked at when looking at Mark, but I mean in here and from my understanding, best we can tell, the second letter to Timothy was written after Philemon.
Yeah, probably very end of Paul's life.
That's right. And so I think it's interesting because in verse 9, it says, "Make every effort to come to me soon. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica." And here in Philemon, Paul had just commended, and included
Demas as a fellow worker
in there as a fellow worker. And so you see how things change and their relationships, their sin. I mean, all these different things that happen. So the question is while we do live in this sinful world, you talked on God's sovereignty and how He can use these types of things. And so, how can a fractured relationship benefit ministry? While we never want to go into it with the mindset of, hey, I'm going to fracture this relationship for the health of the ministry, but how can we see, even in the midst of our sin, God use that to benefit ministry?
I think we see it. The example continues in Acts 15, because what happens is, instead of it just being a 1, 3, or 4 man team that's going out and revisiting all these churches, because that was Paul's ultimate goal. Is just like, listen, let's go. Come on, Barnabas, let's go visit all these churches that we planted and see how they are. Yeah. And now we have these 2 teams that can go in opposite directions, and you visit these churches more quickly, and you probably are planting new churches, and you're ministering along the way. And so, while ultimately the goal is not to have fractured relationships, ultimately the goal ought to be to have unity and to be unified in purpose and plan. There are going to be times where God can use our sinful behavior for His glory, and not that He wants us to sin, but that He can work these things together for good. And so
I feel like that's scriptural.
Yeah, it is a little bit. Again, I don't want that to. I don't want that to be licensed to go out and say, well, now I'm just going to be a jerk to everybody because this could benefit ministry one day. So don't do that. Be gracious and humble. But we see here that ultimately God uses that to send Paul and Silas out, to send Barnabas and Mark out, and we have now 2 teams going out to minister to churches that have been planted and new believers and see that they're growing.
Yeah, and I think, whenever you, kind of going in with that mindset is that it's freeing in the sense of I know that while I am pursuing Christ and kind of, this process of sanctification like we talked about earlier, while I'm pursuing Christ, it's freeing to know that even when I mess up, I can turn to God and say, God, forgive me, I repent of this, and I pray that you can still use this even in the midst of my failure.
Yeah.
And I pray that you can still work through this. And it's freeing to know that God can do that and will do that, and sometimes we might just see consequences to those sins, and it may not feel like there's any kind of benefit, but knowing that God can use those things for his glory. And as I was kind of writing that question, I couldn't help but think, each time we have a fractured relationship, we have this opportunity to go through reconciliation, that's pointing others to the gospel every single time, because that's what the entire gospel is this fractured relationship between God and us that started in the garden, and this whole pursuit, you see God being the one who graciously forgives and offers, this to the point of sacrificing his own son, for the sake of this relational reconciliation. And so anytime we fall short of have a fractured relationship, we should be quick to reconcile that so that we can show the world around us what the gospel really looks like, and it kind of puts feet to that. So one last question to kind of sum up. I like to do this at the end of a series because you go through this 5 weeks and you only have so much time on a Sunday morning. We extend that by doing a podcast. But was there anything specific maybe that either stood out to you as you read or studied that maybe, for lack of a better term, was kind of left on the cutting room floor where it didn't make it to a sermon, didn't have time to address it on a podcast? Anything specific that just stood out to you that you wanted? This is your opportunity to share that.
I had. So generally speaking, this is one of the things that I want people to take away from this. Just because a book in the Bible is short doesn't mean that there's not a lot in there. So like one of the things I want us to be able to do when we pick up Scripture is to be able to take the words and try to glean as much as we possibly can out of them. So every time we pick it up, it's this is one of the things I want to encourage. You can read the Bible over and over and over again and realize I had forgotten that, or I didn't realize that this is what this meant. Now I have new context for this. And so my encouragement is don't assume things or presume things about particular books of the Bible, that some are more important than others. And I've had several people come to me and they were like, I can't believe you got that much out of Philemon, but you really did.
Yeah.
And this is, by the way, this is not a promotion of me.
Right.
There's that much in there.
Sure.
And so I want to encourage our listeners and our church, every time you pick up the word, it is living and active. It's powerful. It is able to teach you, to guide you, to prepare you, to equip you. And so don't just assume, hey, I'm going to do so because you're about to do a couple of sermons on Haggai.
Yeah,
and it's short.
It's
only 2 chapters, but there's a ton in there.
Oh yeah.
And so I want to encourage you, every time you pick up the word, understand that everything in it is powerful and useful and true and points us to Jesus. And so be willing to pick up the word, and even the minutia, the weird stuff in it, because there's some weird stuff in the Bible. Let's not lie. I've shared on Sunday mornings, Jackson and I are reading through the Pentateuch right now, and you're going through some chapters, and you're like, this is weird. Why are we getting all these names? Why are all these people important?
Yeah.
And you can spend time and figure out why all these things matter, and because they all do. So that's kind of the general takeaway. And then as far as specific to Philemon, I think it's the thing that I want us to understand is that relationships within the church are complicated. I think they're maybe more complicated than they are in the world. And what I mean by that is this. The understanding that we are saints, that we are members of the family of God, for a lot of us carry the assumption that means that we're always going to be saintly. And that's just not the case. Like, we obviously, that should be the goal, that should be our desire, is to behave in a way that is a display of God's holiness. But the truth of the matter is, we fail. Like, we're just bad at that sometimes. And I think a lot of people have used that as an excuse to opt out of following Jesus.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them for that in some cases. So I don't want to make that as, I don't want to allow that to be like, well, they were just weak and they were following it. No, we as the people of God have a call in our life to behave and live a particular way. But we also have to understand that the way we as believers behave is not determinative of how true the gospel is. So when we fail, the gospel hasn't failed. We have.
Yeah.
We need to take personal responsibility for that. And that's something that I didn't spend any time talking about, but this was a situation where, like, people failed. And who knows how many ways. We know Onesimus failed.
Right.
But we don't know what precipitated his running away. Like, it could have been that Philemon was a bad master, like in the sense that he was abusive to his slaves. We don't know that, but we don't have any comment from Paul on that. We most of the comments are to his character. Hopefully that's the case, but we don't know that.
Yeah.
And so, like, and it would be presumptuous of us to assume that everything was good. It's also presumptuous of us to assume everything is bad. So I think I would encourage us to understand that relationships within the church are incredibly complex. They are dynamic. It's changing all the time. People are not the same all the time. We like to believe that myth and lie that, like, we just don't change and everybody's just kind of the same all the time. But the truth of the matter is, people are growing, changing. Life circumstances change, and they grow us and change us in different ways. Sometimes they take things away from us and we digress. And so I think the thing that should be a part of our relationships within the church more than anything else is grace. Because life is so complex and people are so complicated, we have to be willing to be patient and give grace. And that's what we see really clearly here in this letter. And I think that's just my biggest takeaway from the letter is, like, relationships within the church are just complex, and we need to understand that, and we need to be okay with that.
Yeah.
We also need to hold people up to standards, like be accountable to one another, but also be willing to give grace as far as is necessary.
Yeah, that's very helpful. It's been a great series, and as always, those of you who listen, if there's anything specific that was shared, throughout the sermon series, or have additional questions about, reach out to us. We can continue this conversation. If you have any questions that maybe we didn't bring up, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd be happy to carry this conversation on further. But as always, we appreciate you listening, and hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.